Welcome to part number 2 of the Projects to Stock Your Shop series here at B.Hooked. This week we're going to be making a darling bow tie mug cozy, and I'm extra excited about this one because I get to teach you just how easy cabled stitches can be. For the written instructions and the supplies list, you want to head over to bhookedcrochet.com/mugcozy. You'll find all the details there. We are going to go through everything in detail here in the tutorial, but for the written instructions and all of those details about the yarn and the colorway I'm going to be using, you'll want to check that out. Also, if you haven't already seen last week's project, you definitely want to check that out because it's a basic knit hand warmer, another really great project to stock your shop, your market tables, and for the holidays, they're really great gifts because they work up quick. That pattern can be found at bhookedcrochet.com/handwarmers. All right, let's go ahead and get started with this mug cozy. We're going to start off our mug cozy with the Longtail Cast On. We're only going to be working with 12 stitches here, so we don't have to get too long of a tail. You can guesstimate this if you would prefer, but I like to also just take a little bit more of an educated approach. So take one of your needles. Now I'm just using double pointed needles because they're shorter and easier to maneuver on camera, but you can use longer straight needles. You can use DPNs because this is a rather small project. You could also use circular needles and use those in the flat if you'd like. Whatever tools you have will do just fine. Leave yourself just a little bit of a tail and then start wrapping your yarn around the needle. And ideally, one of these wraps is equivalent to the amount of yarn that you'll need for one stitch. So I've got 6 there. I'm just going to kind of pinch that off and then double this. This is going to give me more than enough for 12 stitches. And then I'm ready to do the Longtail Cast On. So there's a couple different ways that you can start this. You can create a slip knot first. I typically don't do that. It's just really a personal preference. So I just loop the yarn or just lay it over top of my needle. Now you will want to secure it with your finger if you're not using a slip knot so it doesn't fall off. And then we're going to work with the tail and the working yarn. We're going to insert our fingers in between those two strands. Just kind of gather it up here in the bottom and use your finger and your thumb to open it up a bit. Now the first thing you need to do is swing your needle around and catch that front loop on your thumb, then swing it backwards and catch the loop on your index finger. Now you'll take the loop that's on your thumb and just release it over the tip of the needle, and then just kind of pull on your 2 strands to tighten it up. Now we have 2 stitches cast on our needle, and we're just going to repeat that 10 more times until we have 10 loops on our needle. Now once you have your 12 stitches cast on your first needle, your work should look something like this. You want to make sure that your braid is all down here at the bottom so everything is straight and tidy, and then we're ready to move on to the first row. So we're working with a very simple stitch pattern for the majority of the mug cozy. We're going to be working in stockinette stitch, and that has a 2-row repeat. So that means we're going to do something just slightly different from one row to the next. Starting with row number 1, we just need to knit every single stitch. So if knitting is brand new to you, to make a knit, you want to make sure that you insert your needle from front to back. And then we're going to wrap our yarn around that back needle and pull it through. Now you want to pull on your tail there to tighten up that first stitch. It has a tendency to get a little bit loose on us. And we're just going to repeat that for all 12 stitches. All right, now to move on to the second row of our 2-row repeat, we're going to purl every single stitch. Now instead of inserting our needle from front to back, just like we did for the knit, we're going to do the exact opposite of that and come in from the back and go towards the front. Now you also want to make sure your working yarn is in front of you. So when we were knitting, it was kind of back here. We're going to keep it out here in the front to do our purl stitches. So once you have your needle in the right place, you're still going to wrap it and pull it through. Now the purl is just the exact opposite of the knit stitch. And this is what our work looks like at the end of our second row. Now this is the wrong side of the work. We can kind of see this bumpy texture here on the back, while the right side is over here. We want to make sure that we're looking at that nice, pretty braid, that characteristic look to the stockinette stitch. Now row 1 and row 2 is our repeat for a big portion of our cozy. We're going to work up a big long section, then we're going to do the cable, and then work up a slightly smaller section, and that's going to be the entire project. So what we need to do at this point is work that repeat, row 1 and row 2, over and over until we can count 26 of these little V's. And when you're counting your knitting, the easiest way that I have found to do it is just to look for these V's. Each one of these V's represents one row, so I have 2 rows, and then I have, of course, my row that's on my needle. So what you'll need to do at this point is knit up row 1 and row 2, so the next row is going to be a knit row. Also, another visual cue for you is whenever you're looking at this nice, pretty braided right side, that's your cue that that is a knit row. You're just going to knit every single stitch. And then when you get to the point where you're looking at the work from this angle, where you have the nice bumpy texture, this is the wrong side of the work, or the back, and you're always going to purl when you see this. So you'll just want to repeat rows 1 and 2 over and over until you can count 26 of these little V's. And then of course you'll have your row on your needle. You should be set up and ready to work on a right side row, and we're going to pick up with that cable next. Now at this point, what you have is a piece of work that looks something like this. We just have this nice long little rectangle, and you have counted each one of these V's, and you have made sure that you have 26. Now we're set up to do that cable. So my working yarn is coming from this side here because I want to make sure that I'm working from the right side. If for some reason your working yarn is set up to where you need to work a purl row, go ahead and work that purl row. We're not super concerned with the exact number of rows that you have in this project. As long as you're pretty close, it should still fit on your mug. So the idea of a cable is just taking a group of stitches and kind of working them out of order. So we're going to remove the first 6 stitches from our needle. We're going to hold them aside while we work the last 6 first, and then we're going to go back and work the first 6. And when we do that, it twists these big groups of 6, and that's what gives us our little cable twist. Now I will say that cables are a little bit fiddly. They're not difficult, but they might feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially a 6-stitch cable, because that's a rather large amount of stitches. It's a pretty significant size, so we will feel a little bit of discomfort here, but just hang with me. The result is fantastic. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is I'm just going to use actually another double-pointed needle. So I have 5 in my set here for this size, and I find it easiest to do that when I'm just working with one cable. You can actually purchase cable needles, and if you have one of those, you can absolutely use them. Or if you don't have either of those, you can use a scrap piece of yarn or a stitch holder to hold the first 6. You'll work the last 6 and then you'll replace them on your needle. So there are a few different approaches to this. I find that this one works the best for me. Pick a double pointed needle that is closest to the size that you're working, or if you have another one in your set, or same thing with your straight needle. That's actually not going to work because you do need to have a point at each end just so you can actually remove the stitches and work them off of the needle once again. So grab a double pointed needle or a cable needle and then we'll be set to go. Now the first thing you want to do is just remove your stitches. So I'm really just sliding them from one to the next. Now when I have my 6 needle or my 6 stitches on my needle here, there's 2 ways that we can do this. We can either cable to the front or the back. And what that means is the orientation of where these stitches are that you're skipping. And that's going to just determine the twist, the angle of the twist. So for this one, I like to pull them to the front. So we're cabling 6 to the front and grabbing my working yarn here from the back, which is going to be on this first stitch. All right, so you're going to grab your double pointed needle, insert it into that first stitch knitwise, grab your working yarn, and I like to leave a little bit of slack in this. I'm not really trying to pull it too tight, and then just knit my first stitch, and then continue knitting the remaining 5. Now we can go ahead and just drop this needle. We're not going to use that anymore. Now we're just going to go back to our first double pointed needle. We want to find our first stitch, which was this one right here over on this side. And we need to start knitting from this end of the needle and knit with this end of the needle. So this is where things get a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit fussy. So the first thing you'll need to do is slide it down to this end so you can work with them. Then I'm going to just make sure I'm holding on to the stitches on both sides just so I don't lose anything. The other thing I need to make sure of is that my working yarn is easy for me to access. So I'm just going to pull this back here out of the way. I'm going to continue with my knit stitches, but what I need to do is just kind of force and twist everything kind of in this direction. Now the first stitch is definitely the worst. It's the tightest. So just do the best you can to make this a clean knit stitch and pull it off. And then it'll get easier as you continue knitting the rest of the stitches because there won't be quite so much tension on it. You can take your time with this. Go as slow as you need to go. You really don't want to drop your stitches from the needle, so you have to rework them. Just take your time. And when you get finished with that row, this is what you're going to be left with. And you're probably thinking, that is so confusing. How do I even know where to begin next? Well, that's a pretty justified feeling there. What I like to do is make sure that I always have a good check on my working yarn. That's really going to be my visual cue, my indicator of where I need to start working. So when my working yarn is coming from this direction, then I know I need to flip it. So I'm just going to flip it. And then this is always the first stitch where your working yarn is coming from. and then you're just going to knit in order. So even though it looks twisted and it feels weird and it's really tight, this is going to be your visual cue. Get your working yarn set up and just knit all the way down the row, because even though it's twisted off of the needle, it's not twisted on the needle, and that's really the path that you need to follow. When you're ready to start knitting the next row, we're still going to continue on with our 2-row pattern repeat where we knit a row and purl a row. And even though we cabled that last row, we were knitting, right? So now that means we need to work a purl row. And then we can also just kind of give us a little idea by looking at the texture here below, and that's going to tell us that, hey, we need to purl here. So your stitches will be rather tight on this first row and probably the next few rows from that cable. So I encourage you just to do what you can, go as slow as you need to go in order to make your tension a little bit more uniform. So even though my stitches are rather tight on this needle here, I'm trying to keep them relatively loose over on the other needle. That's just going to help things to settle in and make my cozy look a little bit neater, my stitches to be a little bit more uniform. Now, when you finish that first purl row, things are going to get better from here. It's going to be a little bit more comfortable for you. And we're ready to just pick up now with our pattern repeat. So when I flip it over, it again kind of looks confusing because I know this is supposed to be the right side of the work, but it kind of doesn't look like it's right. It just looks kind of funny. Well, that's because the cable, you need to give it a little bit of help, and it really needs some length here to make up for that full twist. So this is what it looks like on the right side of the work. I just had to give it a little bit of help. So when I flipped it, it initially looked like this, and it just needs a little bit of help to make it look right. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that it's going to curl on you. And this is really just an inherent characteristic of this stitch, and it's something that we will correct at the end with some wet blocking. So we're going to continue on with our stitch pattern repeat. I'm going to knit this row, and we're almost done at this point. We've almost got the full length. We just need to work up a total of 8 rows in stockinette stitch. So that means we're going to count 8 of these little V's directly after the cable. And if you're a little bit unsure of how to count after that, just keep track of the rows that you're on. We've already knit 1. I'm knitting my second here, and we just want to make sure that we have a total of 8 before we move on to the next step, which is the cast off. After you've worked up that repeat a few more times, this is now what our work looks like. We can really see that twist now and how it kind of looks like a bow tie. When we're ready to do the cast off, we want to make sure that we're doing so on a knit row, and you might find yourself scratching your head here because if you are counting row by row, like I mentioned here in the last segment, you'll notice that your 8th row was a knit row, and then that would set you up on the wrong side of the work to purl the bind off, and that's not what we want to do. So just a little explanation of why things are working out this way is because we want to count 8 of the V's after our cables. We really have to start down in here, then we're counting up. And it's just easier to count the rows. And on that 8th row, what we knit or what we purl, whatever row that we're on, that's on our needle. So we're not actually counting it as part of our V here in our work. So that's why I went ahead and purled another row. So technically I worked 9 rows total to get me to this point. Once again, it's not really important. It's not critically important to have the exact number of rows that I do. If you're off by 1 or 2, it's still going to fit your mug and you'll be in good shape. So now we want to work the bind off. We're going to do so with knit stitches. So I'm just going to set myself up to knit my first stitch. And we always want to knit the first two, or do whatever the pattern says, whatever stitch the pattern says. In this case, we're knitting the first two. And then to bind it off, we need to just take this first stitch and pull it over this one here. So just stick your needle under that first one. You can kind of give it a little tug to get some slack on it. And then I use my finger to just make sure that stitch doesn't fall off my needle in the background. And so it looks like that. Then we're going to knit the next stitch. And we'll be in that same position. We want to take this one and pass it over that one. Now, whenever we have just one stitch on this needle over here, that tells us that we need to go ahead and knit one. And then whenever we have two stitches on this same needle, that tells us we need to pass one over to bind it off. And we just want to repeat this until we get to the end of the row. And when you finished your bind off, it should look something like this. A little braided edge. It pretty much mirrors what we have down here on the cast on, and that's kind of our goal. But we're ready to just trim our working yarn. Now you want to leave yourself a tail that's about 4 to 6 inches or so. We're going to use this tail to weave it in so we can hide it. And then just take your current loop that's on your needle and just pull up on it to pull that through. Give that a nice little tug to tighten it up. And now all we need to do are those finishing touches. So I mentioned before that we were going to correct some of this curling with wet blocking, and I want to demonstrate that here just in case this is a completely new concept to you. This is a finishing technique that I always recommend for any and every project that you could possibly wet block. This is going to be the one thing that sets your work apart from other people because it makes it so much neater. Now, if we were to just leave it as it is and put it on our mug, it's just going to look messy, right? It just kind of looks messy like this, and that's what we're trying to fix with wet blocking. So the first thing you're going to need is some kind of blocking board. Now, this is an actual blocking board, and if you want to pick up a set of these, they come in a pack of 9, and I use them all the time. I really love this. You can find that at bhookedcrochet.com/blocking, and that is my affiliate link for that. However, if you just search for blocking board on Amazon, you will find several different options available. You can also find them in your craft store, and if you don't have these and you just don't want to go buy anything, then you can get creative. I've heard of people using corkboard, pinning it to a towel or on their ironing board. A lot of things work. The main goal is that you want to have something that a pin will stick to and that you don't mind getting wet. So the great thing about these blocking boards is that they have a grid marked off. And I like to use that. Each one of these blocks is 1 inch. And I like to use that as my visual cue to keep everything nice and straight. So I might start down here by the cable and just start pinning it. I mean, it's not an exact science here. It really just comes with a little bit of practice. But what I typically do is I will pin out the entire project. I'll kind of stand away, like get some distance from it and have a look and make sure everything looks nice and tidy. And then you can always make adjustments. Now, the other thing you want to keep in mind is that the intent of blocking is really to stretch the stitches out and make it so that they're nice and clean. So that means you have to stretch it a little bit. If I were to just kind of stretch it out to where it naturally wants to lay, it's not going to do much to it. I mean, it would tidy things up a little bit, but I really want to get a little bit of stretch in on it. Now, once you get everything pinned out, The next step is going to be taking a spray bottle and saturating your work with some tap water. There are different things, different methods that you can use. You can soak it first and then pin it down. I like to use this for this type of project and this type of yarn because it's okay. I don't need like a wool wash or anything like that with this acrylic. And I'm soaking it. I want to get it nice and wet, and then I want to allow it to air dry overnight. And if possible, letting it dry for 2 nights is really going to give you the best result. So here's another mug cozy that I'm working on. I've already blocked this one, allowed it to dry. And once that's the case for you, once yours is all ready, then all you need to do is unpin everything. And now look at the difference we see here. This just naturally wants to lay better. It looks a lot neater and tidier. And you will notice that it may start to curl up again. And that's okay. We've blocked it now, so it's kind of primed to stay like this. And then when you stretch it around your mug cozy, it's just going to look like this, nice and tidy. So the next thing we need to do is weave in both of our ends. Now you can start on either end. It really doesn't matter. We want to flip it over because we need to weave it in on the back side. And the technique is going to be the same for both of our ends. And all I want to do is just take it back around. So it's kind of coming from this direction here. I'm just eyeballing it really. The main goal is I want to get my tail so that it's set up to go on the underside nicely. So coming from this direction gives it a little bit better angle for me to weave it in. And then I'm just going to choose one of these rows and then circle my darning needle around each one of these. That's where I'm using a bent tip needle, and these are really handy for weaving in your ends for knitting. But you can do this with a straight needle. It's just not quite as easy. I'm going to go up one side. I don't want to pull too hard down here because I don't want this corner to tuck in. And then you'll just rotate it to the other side and then follow another row in the same way, going back in the opposite direction. Now you noticed I wasn't really careful with getting it exactly under that piece of yarn, that stitch, as clean as possible, because honestly, in my experience, when you split the yarn when you're weaving in your ends, it actually makes it stay in a little bit better. So once you have that nice and secure, you can just go ahead and trim that off and repeat on the other side. Now the next thing we need to do is add 2 of the buttons. So we're going to add them on this side of the work, and you're just going to use any 2 buttons. Honestly, this is the part where you can really get very creative. I have 2 buttons that are about 3/4 of an inch, but really, I mean, you can go as big or as small as you want with this. It really just depends on your overall look. So you will need a darning needle and a scrap piece of yarn. And just a little tip too, I mean, if you're having to use a small darning needle to get the needle through the hole on your button, what you can do is you can split the fiber. So I just caught one of those, and I'm untwisting rather, that ply, and I'm perfectly okay to work with that. So you'll situate your button up in the corner, and then come at it from the back side. Pull that through and go back down. And especially if you pulled the plies apart like I did, you want to go through this at least one more time. Now then you can just flip it over and tie it up on the back. You will want to knot it a couple of times because this ply will probably have a tendency to want to fall apart. We definitely don't want that to happen. And you'll just repeat that for the second button. We have just one more finishing touch to go. This is where your crochet hook comes into play. I'm using a 5mm crochet hook, and that's a good starting point. But if you only have a 4 or 4.5 or 5.5, those are all going to work fine too. Just use what tools you have available. And we're going to start on the side that's closest to the cable. And I just want to pick my first stitch here on the edge and work my hook in that stitch. And now you want to take a new piece of yarn and create a slip knot. Then place that loop on your hook, pull it nice and tight. And we're just going to make a few chains. You don't have to be a crocheter to be able to do this. We're just going to pull what's on our hook. We want to pull it through the stitch. Then we're going to wrap the yarn around the hook and pull it through. That's going to make one chain for us. We'll do that again. 2, and again 3, 4, 5, and 6. We want to have a total of 6 chains, and this is basically going to be the loop that goes around our buttonhole. Now look at your knitting work and find your second stitch, so the one right next to where we fastened on, and just stick your hook in that stitch. And then you'll yarn over and pull through. And we're going to fasten it into place. So now pull this loop through this one. Now we can trim our yarn, and we'll just weave in these 2 ends the way we did before. Now we have this live loop on our hook. So what I want to do is just grab the tail and pull it through the loop on my hook. That's going to secure it, make sure it doesn't go anywhere. And then we have one of our button loops, and we want this to stretch quite a bit. So then once you have this on your mug, then we would just use our chain loop here to secure it to the button. And we should be in pretty good shape at this point. We do want it to stretch quite a bit to really help it to maintain its shape. But if you find that this chain isn't quite long enough, if you need a little bit more length, then all you have to do is add a few more chains. Now, of course, you'll want to repeat that for the other side. And once you do that, all of the finishing touches are complete at this point. I can't wait to see all of the different colorways that you choose and the buttons that you mix in to see how it makes your mug cozy really unique from mine. You can get really creative with this pattern, and I look forward to seeing those photos. So be sure to find me on social. If you like Instagram, you can find me at B.Hooked, or on Facebook, I'm at B.Hooked Crochet. I look forward to connecting with you there and seeing your photos for this project. Now, once again, if you need to get access to the written instructions, the supplies list, and any of the details we talked about here in the tutorial, you can do so at bhookedcrochet.com/mugcozy. And while you're there, you might want to take a look at that project from last week, the Basic Knit Hand Warmer. I think you're really going to love that project. It's a very practical project to make to stock your shop, as well as give for gifts. And you can go ahead and subscribe to the B.Hooked YouTube channel. And while you're at it, if you want to be notified every time I publish a brand new video, so you can be one of the first to watch it, go ahead and just tap that notification bell, and you'll be alerted as soon as I upload something new to YouTube. Now, I want to say a big thanks to my sponsor, Red Heart, for making this series possible. I look forward to serving you up a brand new pattern for this series 1 week from today. And I also just want to take a moment to say thank you. I thank you so much for showing up week after week, for supporting me and enjoying my tutorials here on YouTube. I'll see you next week, guys. Bye. We want to find our first, this double pointed needle really wants to be in the video.